Tonight, we are continuing our Memories of Migration Russländer at 100 webinar series. And in the fall, some of you joined us for our two presentations, Leaving Russia and A New Home in Canada. We are fortunate to have literary scholar Dr. Rob Zacharias with us tonight. But before I introduce Rob, I want to take a moment to remind you why this series was started in the first place. Next year in 2023, the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada is organizing with Tour Imagination what can only be described as an epic three-part tour through Canada in commemoration of the 1920s migration of the Russländer to Canada. The first leg of the tour will start in Quebec City and the last leg will end in Abbotsford. Conveniently, the purpose of this trip is also in three parts. First, to collectively remember the story of our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who undertook this journey from a place steeped in memories, both euphoric and haunting, to a new land, a new language, and a new culture. Second, to re-examine our history through new lenses, to contemplate new themes, themes of race, of displacement, and of tensions, and the role of privilege in our own story. And third, to pay our Reiseschuld, or our travel debt. We've had an exceptional 100 years, and the story could have been much different. So the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada has partnered with Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC, to create a Russländer Remembrance Fund to help support programming in Ukraine, programming with our Indigenous neighbors, and also helping newcomers to Canada. So please get involved in this, what is an historic event, this cross-Canada tour, and many volunteers have been involved in putting this together. All the historical societies, Mennonite historical societies, have helped to organize this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Zacharias, who is an associate professor at York University. Many of us will know his book, Rewriting the Break, Mennonites and Migration in Canadian Literature. He has a new book that it will be coming out soon. We're very excited to see it. It's called Reading Mennonite Writing, a Study in Minor Transnationalism. And he is also, for those of you who are in Winnipeg, going to be in person giving the prestigious John and Margaret Friesen lectures in Anabaptist Mennonite Studies at Canadian Mennonite University in early March. I believe this is also a virtual event, so you can maybe just in person. Rob doesn't know. It might be. We'll contact CMU and they'll tell you. But he will be giving the Friesen lectures, and so be sure to join in for that event. Tonight, he will be giving the presentation, Reading the Russländer in Ukraine on Real and Literary Places. And then he will be taking your questions. So please think up some questions and put it into the Q&A chat spot, and he will answer them. So Rob, take the virtual floor.
All right. Can you hear me all right over there, Aileen? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. When Aileen asked me a while ago if I'd be interested, on the centennial occasion of the Russländer migration, to revisit my dissertation, which studied its retelling in Canadian literature, she said, come on Zoom and chat with some people about it. And here we are a while later with 290 of her closest friends. So it is lovely to see so many people. I see some names I recognize in the chat. Lots of folks from Winkler, which is where I'm from originally as well. So this is a real treat for me. I'm coming to you today from Southern Ontario in Guelph, which is Treaty 3 territory and the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples. But as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Winkler, Southern Manitoba, which is of course Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis. And this is a point that I think is significant, and I'll be coming back to at the close of today's talk. So as Aileen mentioned, my talk tonight will be about the rise and dramatic fall of those Mennonite colonies in what is now Ukraine. And it will be about literature in Canada and about how those two things, far apart in theory, have come together over the years. As it turns out, this dramatic history has been told and retold many times in Canada, and these many fictional retellings was the focus of my PhD dissertation published as Rewriting the Break event. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you'll be able to see some slides here as we go. All right, title slide. Here we go. So Aileen invited me to revisit that project now, and I've enjoyed looking back at it, but I won't be going headfirst into a bunch of academic jargon tonight. Instead, I thought I'd just take my time here to give you highlight a few of the many literary works that have returned to retell this story over the years. I suspect many of you will have read some of them already, but I'll return to some favorites and maybe introduce you to some new ones. And you can think of it as a bit of a tour through the library, as it were. And then I'll reflect at the end briefly on what I see as some of the implications of this retelling, how it's shaped not only, I think, our ideas of a particular time, but also a particular place. So that central question is how the history has been retold, but also, I think, what happens when we experience these larger and longer collective histories through the pages of literature, along with the places themselves. So I suspect that an audience like this one will know something of both this history and about Mennonite literature in Canada, but I won't assume too much, so I'm going to begin with just the briefest of overviews of these two historical contexts. Although I'm not a historian, and I'm happy to pass on any nuanced questions about this history onto Aileen in the question and answer period, the history is central to these retellings. And in brief, the literary retellings which concern us today conventionally begin at the end of the 20th century in what is now now Ukraine. These Mennonites first arrived in that area a century and a half earlier, alongside other German-speaking settlers at the invitation of Catherine the Great, who was aiming to establish Russian control over an area that had long been a Cossack stronghold. And then during their time in Russia, these Mennonites built an extensive network of colonies that were remarkably autonomous and prosperous, to the extent that scholars have sometimes referred to this as the Mennonite Commonwealth, with its manicured villages, impressive farms, and large factories, and as well as their own taxation system to pay for schools and their own hospitals and so on. Due to state pressure and a growing landless class and possibly religious disagreements, thousands of these Mennonites immigrated to Canada during the 1870s. These are the so-called Canadian Mennonites, mostly to Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But some of the wealthiest of these Mennonites who remained in Russia, those whom Sandra Birdsell would rather derisively refer to as the Mennonite Aristocracy in her novel The Russländer, built elaborate estates with impressive courtyards and extensive ornamental gardens, and some with even some artificial lakes and so on. So these images here are from the lovely collection of Paul Tave's Heritage Cruise Lectures called The Russian Mennonite Story. I'll leave that up there for a moment. During World War I and the Russian Revolution that followed, these wealthy colonies became part of the larger battlefield for Ukraine. Various state and anarchist forces swept repeatedly across the countryside, including those led by the charismatic and notorious anarchist Nestor Makhno, who would show up in many of the literary retellings. Some villages established Zilpschutz, or these self-defense units, in an attempt to defend themselves, a controversial practice, as you might imagine, for the pacifist Mennonites. But the Commonwealth collapsed. Hundreds of Mennonites were murdered, and over the coming decades, thousands more lost to labor camps and were threatened by famines. Aided by Mennonites who had earlier immigrated to North America, roughly 20,000 of these Russländer Mennonites managed to flee the Soviet Union to Canada in the early 1920s, often under the most dramatic of circumstances. Of course, excuse me, the vast majority, some 80,000 Mennonites remained behind. Now you might wonder, what does this history from long ago and far away have to do with contemporary Canadian writing? Well, according to Al Reimer, those Mennonites who lived through the collapse of the Russian colonies and made it to Canada became, quote, obsessed with the need to come to terms with that experience by writing about it, end quote. Obsessed might seem like a strong term, but there is a seemingly unending collection of early texts that return to this period, including just innumerable diaries, journals, and memoirs, some of which have been published professionally, some privately, and some in archives, and I suspect many more in attics. And Reimer reports that there are also some 30 German language novels written by immigrants to Canada, lamenting the loss of the colonies. He says these were marked by what he calls a, quote, Heimatdichtung style of nostalgic recollection and yearning for a culture and way of life which had been innocently destroyed by evil forces beyond human comprehension, end quote. In the 1980s, as scholars were first beginning to think of literature by Mennonites in collective terms, that is something we can think of as Mennonite literature, one set of scholars, including Reimer himself and Harry Lowen, his colleague at the University of Winnipeg, began thinking of a critical genealogy that positioned the retelling of this Russian experience not simply as one of the important stories that would be told by Mennonite literature, as, for example, John Ruth was arguing in the US, but as the birth of a Mennonite literary culture. Reimer suggested, quote, the destruction of the Mennonite Commonwealth shocked the literary imagination into life. Well, Lowen observed that when the Mennonites lived securely in Prussia for almost 300 years, they wrote almost no creative works. But when their past vanished almost overnight, their present bleak and dismal, and their future unknown to them, they abruptly began to write. It is out of this chaotic and hopeless situation that Mennonite literature was born, end quote. These were the types of claims that when I was a grad student were really exciting. I said, what does it mean to suggest that this bloody history, which took place on another continent a century ago, was one of, or perhaps even the kind of animating force behind the emergence of Mennonite literature in Canada, which by the time that Lowen and Reimer were writing was this rich field of many writers that were nationally recognized and so on. Today, however, this type of claim is one that few literary critics would be prepared to affirm without some careful qualification, and even to the limited extent that I did in that study. Contemporary critics are, well, notoriously suspicious, I should say, of these types of originary claims, especially for something as nebulous as a body of literature, which in any case is simply too rich, too full of other important stories, other key authors, for there to be something that we could identify as a clear and singular beginning. But for me, the claim itself was significant. And certainly there's no question that this Russländer narrative was a key story. And not only for the early Mennonite immigrants themselves. There's now a long list of authors who have returned more recently to retell those stories in English, writing not as participants in that history themselves, but as members of a broader community in which that history remains significant. So how often has this history been told? Well, even an abbreviated list of notable Canadian memoirs and fiction that included a focus on this history is extensive. It would include work like Dietrich Neufeld's creative nonfiction, A Russian Dance of Death, The Diary of Anna Berg, and Arnold Dick's Lost in the Steppe, these all early, all originally in German. It would include Gerhard Lorenz's Storm Tossed, Barbara Smucker's Days of Terror, and Rudy Wiebe's Blue Mountains of China, all published before 1980. More recent work would include Al Reimer's My Harp Is Turned to Mourning, certainly, and John Weir's Creative Step. With a bit of digging, you might be able to locate a 1981 original screenplay entitled Night Train from Moscow, and more recently, the 3 books of Janice Dick's Storm trilogy, Calm Before the Storm, Eye of the Storm, and Out of the Storm. You'd find Arthur Krager's Hard Passage and Annie Jacobson's Watermelon Syrup, and of course, Sandra Birdsell's Russländer, and I'm going to suggest its sequel, Children of the Day. You'd find Elena Muntz's When I Was Young and in My Prime, and Sarah Clausen's The Wittenbergs, and on and on and on. Now, each of these books, there we go. Sorry about that. Each of these books are unique, of course, but many follow a surprisingly uniform 3-part structure. They begin in order with stories of the colony's structured daily life, its simple pleasures, its sprawling farms. This pastoral stage is followed by a dramatic slide into chaos as the Commonwealth collapses into a confusion of murder, theft, and rape. These horrors lead almost inevitably, to a final stage of emigration or mass flight, with Canada presented usually in passing at the very end as sort of a space of refuge and safety. So we have order and then chaos and flight. But this is not to say that all the novels tell the same story. In rewriting the break event, I suggested that we can identify several strains in which these stories tend to fall. Strains like the ethnocultural strain or the theological strain, the trauma narrative, and meta narratives. Looking back from a decade, I can see that this structure risks downplaying some important differences, but I think it's still helpful in understanding some of the sort of general and notable ways in which the story has been told. And it sort of collectively has emerged in a type of a debate about this key period. So I want to take the rest of my time here today to just peek into 6 of the many texts that have returned to this history. And the first one I want to talk about with you is Lost in the Steppe by Arnold Dick. Excuse me. Reimer and Lowen had noted that the earliest retellings of this story were characterized by their nostalgia for the Mennonite world left behind in Russia. And Dick was unquestionably the most prominent writers working in this vein. Born in Ukraine in the late 19th century, Dick lived through the collapse of the colonies and emigrated to Manitoba in 1923. Today, he's probably best remembered for his warm and gently satirical portraits of a Mennonite life on the Canadian prairies. But in the midst of the Second World War, he published a serialized novel about the Mennonite world in Russia under the collective title Verloren in der Steppe, a book later translated in 1974 as Lost in the Steppe. I've got my copy with me here. Lost tells the story of Hans Taves, a young child growing up in a Mennonite village of Hochfeld in what's now Ukraine, during the height of the Commonwealth's golden years. Although the novel is considered a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story, in truth, Hans's development is almost completely overshadowed by the novel's exhaustively detailed portrait of that Commonwealth. And no aspect of colony life is too mundane to be explored at length. There is, for example, a lengthy description of a milk bench and a milk rod that comes complete with 2 of Dick's hand-drawn illustrations. Chapter 2 is entitled The Small Room, and I'll show it here in its entirety. You see, it's literally entitled The Small Room, and it is a description of, as promised, a small room. You've got an overview there. You've got a couple of pictures of the things that you can be found in the room, including a Kroger clock, and it wraps up with an overview of the house so you can find out where the small room is located. Chapter 3 is called The Corner Room, and Chapter 4, The Great Room. A couple of sections here from Chapter 4 for you to see. So you get the idea. The first 2/3 of the entire novel are like this, carefully documenting first the rooms and the houses, and then the neighbors' houses, the neighborhood, grandparents' house, festivals, and so on. So by the time Dick was publishing the 4th and 5th books in the volume, readers had more or less been purchasing a highly enjoyable sort of encyclopedia entry. And I don't necessarily mean this in a bad way. The book is lovely to read. It's told from this sort of faux, naive narrator, childlike perspective, and it's witty, and there's a plot that weaves leisurely through the first 2/3 of the novel. And it's a testament to Dick's ability as a writer that it remains such a pleasure to read. Now, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Lost in the Steppe and his detailed portrait of that world are the 2 things he manages to avoid. The first is religion. For all its careful accounting of the physical and social world of these Mennonites, Lost manages to almost completely overlook their faith. In stark contrast to, literally every other book I've read that returns to this period in time, Dick's characters are never to be seen reading the Bible, praying, or entering a church. One reason for this, I think, is that Dick, especially when he's writing this from Canada a few decades later, is most interested in presenting the Mennonites of Russia as a distinct people with their own culture, their own language, their own way of life, something he wrote about quite a bit in his own letters and in his other fiction. It's almost the idea of constructing a Volk of a sort. The other notable absence in Dick's novel, or I should say a near absence, is the collapse of the colonies that he so lovingly documents. It's notable because Dick lived through that violence himself. He came face to face with Machno at one point before his emigration. But the story of Hans Taves stops just immediately prior to the First World War. It's like he wants to bring us into that safe world and just sort of keep us there. And the fact that the novel's written in the present tense throughout, one of the only novels that returns to this period that does that, sort of affirms this attempt to bring us back to that world and keep us in it. But a close reading shows how thoroughly even this type of narrative gets structured by the violence that's coming. There are, passing indications of a rising tension on the colonies throughout, for example, and the novel, which is mostly warm and funny, told from a child's perspective, begins rather strangely with a funeral. But most interestingly, and what I want to kind of pause on here as my last point on this novel, is that there's a number of telling asides that get slipped into the book throughout that proleptically leap forward in a warning, encouraging readers to appreciate what is presented as about to be lost. So at these moments, another narrator kind of intrudes into the text, taking on this suddenly earnest voice and informs the reader of the horrors to come. There's some really interesting passages. I'll just choose one to show you here. And this is early in the novel. And readers are told, being introduced to the house that belongs to Hans's grandfathers. And suddenly we're told it's going to one day be destroyed. Hans says, "What about all these books and papers that his grandfather kept?" And then he responds, "They too were dead. They were burnt when all Russia burned, when the 100-year-old house with its blue-edged white shutters, with grandmother's chest and grandfather's corner cabinet went up in flames, when all of Neerhorst was reduced to ashes." It's good that the old man did not see that. If, like his grandson, he had been forced to stand before the burning Neerhorst, before the smoking ruins of all the other colony villages, and before the countless graves of those overtaken by his cruel destruction, he would have joined his grandson in bitter accusation of those who, 100 years ago in Danzig, caused the immigrant wagons to roll, end quote. So this moment, it's hard for me to kind of express how out of keeping in tone and focus these sorts of proleptic moments are with the rest of the text. And they really force us to rethink the rest of the text, kind of reminding us over and again of what's about to happen. But he quickly gets back to his regular sort of lighthearted fare. So after this devastating flash forward, for example, he just immediately resumes the light banter of the novel. Quote, "All this happened many years later. Today, the small Hans still avoids getting near that strange old man that's his grandfather," end quote. So while it's true that the plot of Dick's novel concludes before the collapse of the colonies, it's also true that the reader cannot help, as Edna Phrase puts it in a lovely turn of phrase, remembering what will happen to the world being described. Now, in the library of books that return to this story, I'm suggesting that Lost in the Steppe is notable in part because of how thoroughly it avoids engaging religious aspects of the Mennonite experience in Russia. As you might imagine, it's much, much more common for the books that return to this period to record at least the very many ways in which religion and church and faith structured Mennonite life in the period. In some retellings of this history, however, this past is retold with a clear intent to focus on and explore the religious or theological implications that this period holds for the community. In these types of works, the narrative is shaped in accordance with a larger theological argument. So examples of this type of fiction would include Janice Dick's Storm trilogy, certainly, maybe Barbara Smucker's Days of Terror, as well as the second book that I want to look at here next, and it's Al Reimer's 1985 novel, My Harp Is Turned to Mourning. Reimer, as you will have surmised, was a major figure in Mennonite literature, influential as a critic, as an editor, and as a writer. Harp is his only novel, and it tells the story of the young Wilhelm Fast, an aspiring artist who becomes a village teacher in the Machta colony just before the Commonwealth's collapse. Unlike Dick, Reimer makes no effort to avoid the violence of that collapse. Over the course of the book, Wilhelm loses his father, both his brothers, his in-laws, and his pregnant wife before he manages to flee to safety in Canada. And the key for me here, I think, of an interest to us in this discussion, is not simply that Reimer, unlike Dick, delves headlong into the violence of that collapse, but rather that he insists on this theological frame for understanding it. And crucially, that he refuses kind of simplistic answers to the difficult questions that it raises. Now, some of you will have noted probably that Reimer's title, My Harp Is Turned to Mourning, is taken from the biblical book of Job. And you might wonder if this reference is meant to imply that the suffering Mennonites were as righteous as Job, and similarly as blameless in God's sight. To the contrary, Reimer levels a stinging critique of the Mennonites' long-cherished principle of separation from the world, and offers some unflinching portraits of both the material inequalities that characterized the Mennonite colonies and the occasional use of religious rhetoric to justify it. In fact, the section in which Reimer invokes Job directly is set some 70 years prior to the Russian Revolution as part of an earlier character's failed efforts at church reform. and worries about their efforts to isolate themselves from the world. Yeah, we Mennonites began building separate little worlds for ourselves, he says, and perhaps it was our big mistake right from the start. We separated ourselves from the world so we could live for him, not so we could build bigger and richer estates. Like Job, my harp is turned to mourning. It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Ah, Heavenly Father, thy terrible loving will be done. This passage crystallizes the novel's larger theological interpretation of the history it represents, and Reimer uses several subplots to sort of stage theological debates about yieldedness and Gelassenheit and theology and pacifism and so on. And he grapples seriously with the establishment of the Selbstschutz, for example, and with Machno's class critique and more, even as his book, like Dick's, or like many of the others in this library, although not Dick's, I should say, concludes with its protagonist thankful for his safe arrival in Canada. So we have Lost in the Steppe and My Harp is Turned to Mourning, two very different accounts of the same time and place, but they do share a relatively straightforward historical drive, both full of rich historical detail and a narrow focus on the Mennonite community itself. It's very much about this particular group of people at this particular place at this particular time. Another strain of novels that return to this history is more self-conscious, both about the larger contexts of this history and the very process of its retelling across generations. We can think of this as the meta-narrative strain, after Linda Hutchinson's term for this type of work. She calls it historiographic metafiction. So in books like Annie Jacobson's Watermelon Syrup or John Weir's Steppe and many others, the Russländer narrative comes to readers not directly as a sort of historical, objective third-person perspective, but through other forms of telling, in found documents like diaries, in snippets of myth and fiction, under the work of archivists who are digging into their parents' or grandparents' pasts. And one of the most memorable of these types of retellings can be found in the third novel I want to look at tonight, and that's Rudy Wiebe's 1970 novel, The Blue Mountains of China. Wiebe's novel, which follows an extended set of extended relatives and neighbors and friends across 3 continents and a full century of time, includes a dramatic chapter on the collapse of the Russian colonies, perhaps the most memorable sort of single chapter that I can think of. But it also shows Mennonites around the world retelling that same chapter or that same Russländer narrative again and again, including in the jungles of Paraguay, where one character says, "What else do we have to remember or talk about? The one big thing." Over the years, he continues, as you think about it, this central thing gets more and more meanings. When you keep thinking about this one thing for so long, after a while, you can't be certain whether you actually saw it like that right from the start, or whether that little time so long ago has foreshortened in your mind. And as you think of these things, the central thing gets more and more meanings, like a sponge, soaking all your memories into it and leaving nothing, just it. The structure and the plot of the larger novel interrogates this type of narrow focus, forcing characters and us as readers to move beyond the sort of gratifying simplicity of those narrower focus, the one big thing, and just tossing us all into a larger set of loosely related histories. Now, I don't know how many of you have read that novel, but it is an experience. We've moved so quickly between characters and continents and decades, and has so little interest in sort of telling us who these people are and where we are, that it can be dizzying to follow. Indeed, one scholar has suggested that the book, quote, seems to have been devised to discourage ordinary readers, end quote. Well, never mind ordinary readers, whoever those people might be. A major academic journal in Canada published an 8-page genealogy after we published his book in order to help out the scholars. But that complexity, of course, is part of the point. Wiebe is challenging our desire for a simple story, for an easy narrative, and he's reinserting some of the contested complexity of history, forcing us to participate in how those stories come together to create meaning, not just a simple singular narrative. Excuse me. Now, if we are looking in Canadian literature for more challenging accounts of this Rusländer narrative, we can also look beyond the pages of Mennonite literature as it is conventionally understood. Perhaps the most notable of such accounts can be found in the fourth book that I want to introduce you to tonight. It's called The Doomed Bridegroom by the Ukrainian-Canadian poet, critic, and author Myrna Kostash. In a rhetorical debate she holds with an imaginary Mennonite partner, Kostash expresses her shock and dismay at coming across her own people's history in Ukraine in the pages of Mennonite Canadian literature. She writes, "I didn't know about you from our narratives, but rather from the literature you wrote in Canada, and I read as Canadian texts. And there, to my appalled fascination," she continues, "I learned that you were my raging, guilt-ridden, trespassing boss, or his loutish elder son, or his bookish younger one. I learned about your plain-speaking God and my avenging revolutionary angel, Nestor." And she goes on to offer quick, close readings of the books that we've discussed so far, by Dick, by Reimer, by Wiebe, and then she continues in her analysis. She says, "There is no other news here between the revolution and the dying. No mention of the manifestos or newspapers, programs or decrees, nothing of land reform or workers' councils or women's suffrage, no slogans or songs or eulogies, only death. One day you have money, a plump wife, thick crops in the fields and apples tumbling like coins in the orchard, and the next day your wife is dead, your brothers scattered, your children starving, and the apple trees like limbs broken like sticks." Now, there's lots we could unpack here, but for now, let me simply underscore that Kostash's memoir reminds us that A, we're not the only ones reading our literature, and B, that others have recognized it as making a claim of sorts, not only about a time, but a place. Kostash dismisses both the literature and the Mennonites' time in Ukraine. Quote, "The land had been Mennonites 128 years when the revolution came," she writes. Quote, "A blink of an eye. That's how long." Now, I have two more books I'd like to discuss, and they're both by the same author. Sandra Birdsell's 2001 novel, Russländer, is told through the eyes of its introverted protagonist, Catherine Katja Vogt, who was raised in the colonies in the early years of the 20th century. Birdsell is clearly keen to emphasize the significant gender, class, and ethnic divisions that marked colony life. And she has Katja born into a large landless family that oversees a Mennonite estate's operations and their local laborers. The haughty estate owner named Abraham Suderman is just this deeply unsympathetic character, foolishly provokes a group of anarchists and aggrieved workers who have gathered on the estate midway through the novel. And it's only through the foresight of her father that Katja manages to hide and escape the massacre that ensues. 11 Mennonites, including 7 members of Katja's own family, are murdered. And the final third of the novel recounts the young Katja's difficult emotional recovery, and at the novel's close, she joins a wave of Mennonite migrants to the Canadian prairies. Now, on its surface, the Rusländer should sound familiar. It's another novel returning to this time and this place, and it follows that narrative arc so common in these texts: the order of the Commonwealth prosperity, the chaos of its collapse, and then the flight to the peace of Canada. Importantly, Birdsell routes her story by way of a framing narrative through the memory of the novel's aging protagonist. So although the majority of the novel takes place in the colonies, it's being retold by Katja from a Mennonite assisted living facility in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The elderly Katja, now Catherine, is recounting her life story at the prompting of an eager young archivist who's traveling across Canada recording the Rusländer narratives for an archive in Saskatchewan. It is, in other words, another story about how this story gets told. What's so interesting to me about this story is that the framing narrative of the novel explicitly acknowledges, at a kind of structural level, that the most immediate real and imagined space of the novel and this history is contemporary Winnipeg. At the novel's end, we as readers are back into the 1980s, back into the Winnipeg retirement home, and Catherine is exhausted from telling her story. The archivist has turned off his microphone and is sharing some anecdotes about a recent trip he took to the former colonies. He shows Katya a photo of the teachers' seminary, which had, quote, gained a statue of Lenin with his arm raised, end quote. He describes the few remaining schools, houses, and factories as, quote, memories for the relatives to visit on yearly pilgrimages, end quote. He had watched tourists push through fields of grain in search of the house foundations, he said, and watched them try to find an abandoned well they'd been told about. And in one of the most memorable scenes in all of the novels retelling this history, he describes a boat ride he and the other tourists took near the mighty Zaporizhian Dam, built after the collapse of the world that Birdsell so carefully described in her larger book. He says, they went out in boats on the Dnieper to drift for moments over the place where the village of Anlaga had been, submerged now since the building of the dam. Looking down through the water, they could see the roof of the church, a wavering dark behemoth, and what appeared to be a row of spires, but which were tree trunks marking out where the streets had been. Below the spires were rectangular shapes, the walls of houses, broken shells where water plants now grew from the river silt, a refuge for fish. The village, the archivist continues, is quote, completely covered over, flooded, gone, end quote. Katya, however, pauses, flooded, she thinks, but not drowned, end quote. So through the archivist's comments, Birdsell closes her novel with a reminder that the imaginative history, the remembered history of the Mennonite Commonwealth cannot be easily projected onto the contemporary Ukraine. There's a real risk, it implies, when visiting any foreign place in search of its past, never mind as the setting for historical fiction, of effectively ignoring the present. This risk is heightened perhaps in places with complex and ongoing histories of imperialism, where heritage tourism, if poorly done, could risk nostalgically projecting the trappings of settler colonialism back onto the very landscapes from which it was forcefully rejected. Now, when I first read Birdsell's novel, I had been reading so much of Mennonite literature and so many different retellings of this story, but it was Katya's vision of those former colonies that enthralled me. And I completely overlooked the archivist's descriptions. So then when I had the opportunity in the final stages of my studies to visit Ukraine with my father, it was her vision of the area that pressed most clearly on my imagination. So my father and I had traveled to visit the remnants of this fabled period of Mennonite history. And it was a time and a place that I knew first and best through the fiction of these authors working half a world and nearly a century away from its height. And, you know, on arrival there, I'm sure many of you listening here will have been there yourself. And you'll know that the worlds retold in these novels and can still be faintly read in the landscape today. So I'm going to just show a few things here. For example, in the girls' school in Kortitsa, for example, or the Wilms Mill in Molochnia, you can see these impressive landmarks that are still in use today. And you can find remnants of this world in the numerous memorials that have been erected, including a couple here by Paul Epp, the second here on the right at a train station at Lichtenau, excuse me, commemorating the thousands of Mennonites who, like Katya, began their journeys to Canada at these stations. And it was the fictional pseudonym estate from Birdsell's novel, that leapt to mind when we explored the abandoned Mennonite estates, such as this one, the Heinrich Wilms house. Much more immediate, however, much more sort of concrete upon our arrival, was our experience of that world as it's described by Birdsell's young archivist, that one that's been crossed and layered by these longer, larger, and contradictory histories, as, for example, in this large bust of the Marks that I saw standing outside a one-time Mennonite elementary school, or indeed at the iconic 700-year oak tree, propped up by a network of metal poles and heavy ropes in a small park, being preserved in celebration, not of course in reference to the Mennonite time in the area, but rather to the importance of the classic history of the place. So I noted earlier that Birdsell's novel, The Russländer, follows that order, chaos, flight trajectory that's so common to the retellings of this history in Canadian fiction. And as is the case in most of these novels, Katya's arrival in Canada is presented sort of in passing, and the prairie landscape acts as a sort of landing pad, a space of refuge and safety, sharp in its contrast from the chaos that has been left behind. And as is often the case in novels writing this story, Birdsell's protagonist finds comfort in the way that the Canadian prairies resemble the Ukrainian steppes, so that it's almost as if they're arriving to the very place they had just left, but without the violence. So immediately following her discussion with the archivist about that flooded village, the elderly Katya reflects on how prosperous and fortunate her time in Canada had been. And then the book closes with her describing her arrival on the Canadian prairies decades ago. She told him that when their journey ended in Manitoba, Birdsell writes, she was amazed at how similar the countryside was to the steppe that had been their former home. So that's the final scene of the Russländer. But that's not where Birdsell's story really ends. And I want to turn now for our final novel of the night. It's another one by Birdsell, and this is published several years after the Russländer, when Birdsell returns to the Vogt family again. Here, the portrait of Canada as a landing pad or blank slate, or terra nullius, so common in the retelling of this history, is confronted, crossed, complicated in profound and urgent ways. Katya's younger sister, Sarah Vogt, has grown up. They're all in Canada, of course, and she's married a Métis man named Oliver Vandal. And the two live in their tumultuous life with their 10 kids together in a small, in the prairies in southern Manitoba. In this second novel, the parallel between Canada's prairies and the Ukrainian steppes that's established at the end of the Russländer, and which is common in the novels returning to this period, is sharply inverted. No longer does this similarity seem to promise a return to the golden ages of the Commonwealth. Now these parallels seem to caution, a level of question. How will these immigrant Mennonites interact with those peoples already living on this land this time around, with those who have larger and longer claims to the area to which we have now come? This is a question that Birdsell, excuse me, who is herself of both Métis and Mennonite descent, has explored in her earlier fiction. But here she links that question directly to the Russländer experience explored in her best-selling novel. At the very moment that the violence breaks out in the closing pages of The Children of the Day between the Métis and the Mennonites over who owns this particular Mennonite farmstead, Birdsell pauses that story and flashes back to the climactic moment of the Russländer, her earlier text, when the anarchists had arrived at the Mennonite estate and slaughtered the owners in the colonies. It's a startling moment where one book leaps back to the other, and Birdsell reminds us, as readers, of the parallels between these two texts and these two larger and longer histories, positioning the Mennonites' successes and failures during their 125 or so years in Ukraine alongside their histories here in Canada, where at the time that Birdsell was writing this novel, they had been, well, we had been for almost exactly the same amount of time. Or as Kostas might describe it, for a blink of an eye. That's how long. So I gave my talk today the title, Reading the Russländer in Ukraine on Literary and Real Spaces. And I hope I've given you enough of a taste of the many books that return to this history to encourage you to go out and track a few of these down and read them yourself. I don't think I've spoiled them all in terms of their endings. But I hope it's also clear, if only through my implications, that I don't think there's always a clear distinction to be drawn between the imaginary or literary and that quote unquote real. Instead, I think our understandings of times and places are always deeply shaped by our memories, our expectations, and yes, by the stories that we hear and tell. Literature isn't history, and it shouldn't be mistaken as such. But when it returns time and again to the same time and place, it offers us a valuable opportunity to remember and commemorate, yes, but also to listen, to engage, and to negotiate that past, and with it, perhaps, our present. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for that fascinating talk. And if we were in person, you'd be able to hear the applause, but you'll just have to read the accolades in the chat. So please go ahead and congratulate Rob. And also thank you, Rob, for reminding me of Treaty 1, where I skipped over that paragraph in my introductory comments. And of course, we are on Treaty 1, which is not only the homeland of the Métis, but also of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, And I think that my mistake clearly demonstrates the ways in which settlers easily erase Indigenous history. And it's wonderful that Sandra Birdsell was able to link that erasure and that tension back to what took place in Ukraine. And I think that that's a strong lesson for all of us as we contemplate this history. But we will now turn to, and I also forgot to introduce the center and my co-director, Ben Nobsteeson, and I believe myself in addition to that. So of course, this is being put on by the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Dr. Nobsteeson and myself are the co-directors of that center at the University of Winnipeg. But now we will get to the questions that are rolling in. And Dora asked the first question of you, Rob, and she says, fascinating about what's absent in Arnold Dick's book, Faith. Curious though, did children at that time go to church? Perhaps if they didn't, could that partially explain the absence?
Thank you, Dora, and thank you for that question. So that's a great question. Of course, there was the question of secularization of the Mennonites in this time. I'm sure, Aileen, you can answer this question better than I could, except that I can say that Dick's novel stands out in relation to the many other novels that return to this same time and place. So he's not alone in emphasizing what we might consider the ethnic elements and downplaying some of the religious elements. But the novel stands out when you line it up against the dozens and dozens of other texts that I've read. It really stands out for its almost conscious setting aside of these elements.
Yeah, that's a very interesting contradiction for Dick. And now we will go to Robert, who says, I find Kostash's critique of Mennonites in Ukraine rather reckless, but also fascinating. An outsider's point of view, is it possible for us Mennonite readers to step similarly outside the frame while reading Mennonite literature?
Well, I can tell you a little bit more about Kostash's book. That second question is no doubt a challenge, but I think they might be related in terms of the possible answers. So Kostash's novel, The Doomed Bridegroom novel, she calls it a memoir, although I've heard her say that they forced her to call it a memoir for marketing purposes. It's this sort of imaginative, half dream stage, half about her life and half sort of literary criticism, and sometimes it's fiction. So it's a fascinating text. This section, however, where she takes on this sort of imaginary rhetorical partnership with this Mennonite who she scolds about the text, is fascinating for me because she goes to these very same texts, many of the ones that Mennonites have read for years and sort of understand as kind of retelling this fundamental story. And like you said, reads it in a totally different way. I think you're right, perhaps, to suggest it's a little reckless, but she goes on, she's a literary critic as well, and she goes on and gives a surprising amount of but she's a coherent and cogent critique of some of these texts. She even has titles for the types of stock characters that the Ukrainians get. She says, you've got the Ukrainian slut, you've got the Ukrainian blockhead laborer, and she goes on and shows all these texts. So there's no question that someone coming from outside that tradition and reading it with a more set of critical eyes can be pretty revealing of the limitations that sometimes we're able to sort of overlook because we think we know how the story is supposed to be told. And so that question of whether we're able to step outside the narrative is certainly challenging. One way, of course, is to engage with people like Kostash who are doing that critique and read those texts and say, okay, now go back with fresh eyes and take a look at it. But the other way, I think, is to read across texts, right? Read widely. One of the fascinating things about this story is the way in which it's been told so often that a sort of rhetorical debate emerges across the texts. And sometimes it's really explicit. So for example, John Weir's Steppe takes a passage from Arnold Dick's Lost in the Steppe, and he rewrites it and has this Ukrainian teacher berating the students for their ignorance about the land in which they live. He's using the same scene, the same teacher's name and everything from Lost in the Steppe, but he never mentions it. He just rewrites it with this other set of concerns into the text. So that debate is like really literal in that case. And then there's other examples where like Arnold Dick years later would go back and write a sequel to the novel, to Lost in the Steppe, in which he grapples with the violence directly. Rudy Wiebe, 40 years after Blue Mountains of China, writes an extra chapter to Blue Mountains of China, where some characters go back to Ukraine and they sort of reinvest in this idea that he's questioning in Blue Mountains of China. And Al Reimer too, like 25 or 30 years later after his book, came back to write an additional chapter in his book, what's it called? When War Came to Kleindorp. So there is this debate happening kind of within the individual authors, but also across the texts that we get to kind of track when we read across the work. Sorry, I got on a tangent there. It's also exciting.
No, that was a wonderful description. And so a lot of times we as just normal readers will read individual texts and not actually see these links and connections. But you as a literary scholar, of course, this is what you do, is that you analyze these texts and like illuminate for us all of these things that we wouldn't necessarily have picked up on our own as we read them, with a year in between.
Sure.
So this is really, this is such a rich discussion.
Aileen, are you saying you don't constantly read Mennonite literature?
You know what, Rob, can I be perfectly honest, is I have a very hard time reading literature from this period because I know the historical context so well, and I know the types of characters there are and what is possible and what isn't possible, that it drives me crazy. So I like to read texts that are outside of my area of expertise so that I can enjoy and be fulfilled by this text. But for this area, yeah, I struggle with reading all of these texts.
So that's why we need your readings of the text to help us out with that critique as well. But anyways, this is a conversation for another time.
Yeah, but it shows that the importance of having both historians and literary scholars and how our work interacts with each other, and that you can't have one without the other, right? We create an ecosystem together. But I'll go back to the questions. John asks, in what way did the detour through Paraguay influence Mennonite Canadian literature?
Sorry, can you ask that again? It just broke up for a moment.
In what way did the detour through Paraguay influence Mennonite Canadian literature?
Okay, well, this is putting me on the spot. So in relation to this particular story, so the Russländer story, it's almost always told as a kind of single line emigration from Ukraine to the Canadian prairies. Sometimes there's mentions, yes, there's the American context as well, but the story gets told teleologically, right? So typically it's Canadians, Mennonites, who are saying, how did I get here? And they've heard so many stories about this sort of singular directional story, and they retell it as such. Of course, there is this rich historical period of Paraguay that's directly related to this. And the only novel that leaps to my mind that brings this narrative directly into contact with the Russländer narrative is Rudy Wiebe's Blue Mountains of China, where there are these characters in Paraguay, in Canada, in the US, in Ukraine, in China, all related to each other. And if you read the text 4 or 5 times, you start to follow those, those relationships and realize that Wiebe is showing this sort of loose network that crosses the globe. Now for Wiebe, he uses that Paraguayan chapter to parallel some of the questions of indigenous peoples and the Mennonite settler colonial projects. And so he's making a parallel between what's happening in Paraguay to what's happening in Canada to what happened prior in Ukraine. Now, it's not a flattening of it. It's not a direct equation in any sense of the term, but he's drawing these sorts of parallels across continents and also at times across centuries. There are, of course, other writers who have returned to the Paraguay story, but it's relatively light. So Dora Dueck, for example, has written this. I know there's a children's picture novel about picture story about the Paraguayan story as well, but it's relatively light in the works of Canadian Mennonite writing.
Yeah, that's a fascinating element of the story of how much that Russia, Canada, migration has just absolutely dominated the discussion in there. I mean, some people went to Mexico from, there's all sorts of different types of stories that can be told that are encompassed under this migration, but yet that one, and like you said, the ways in which the novels are being told, and you have this these format that people are following is really quite striking.
Yeah, Dick made a comment about there being just these ready-made plots, which of course is true in the sense that there are these key figures that show up in all these novels, like Machno shows up, B.B. Jantz shows up, kind of key moments and key characters show up in all the texts. And there's such a dramatic story that it shouldn't be a surprise that this has become such a central retelling. But you're quite right that there's all these other moving parts, including, Canadian narratives that were deeply implicated in this history. And at the very same time, of course, that the Russländer coming here, the Mexican, they're heading to Mexico as well. So there are these moving parts that are rarely illustrated in concert with each other.
And I think that we can see the same thing happening in the telling of this history from the historical point of view, is that there's this dominant view and that all these other stories were pushed aside for this one way of viewing this. But I'm going to go now to Marlene's question, which is, if you could write the next great Russländer novel, which we're all very excited about you writing, Rob, from what perspective would it be written? Who would be the main character?
You know, before you give talks like this, you anticipate what are the questions that are going to be asked of me. And you think, well, maybe I could go this direction, or I could answer this question. I confess, Marlene, I did not anticipate this question. So I will not be writing the next Russländer novel. And not simply because my own background is Canadian. That didn't stop Al Reimer, for example. But I do think it's an interesting question. You know, for other people who are continuing to write this story, it's getting complicated in really interesting ways. So there's a couple of figures, people who are writing versions of the story right now that I don't think I'm at liberty to sort of share, but they will be coming out, and they'll be challenging them in other ways. But even just the Russian context for the Mennonite experience, it's just so, it continues to be told in so many different ways. In like, I don't want to ruin too many, don't want to step on too many new books. But for example, the American author Sofia Samatar has a new memoir fantasy book that came out called The White Mosque, which isn't about the Russländer narrative, but is about the Ukrainian Russian Mennonite experience. And it's just come out now, and it's this fascinating retelling, very experimental. So there doesn't seem to be pause in the interest. It just won't be fulfilled by me.
That's unfortunate, Rob. I think that you could really add to.
It really isn't, actually.
Yeah, well, and just with the retelling of sort of reincorporating the situation in Russia, when you were talking about how you have this stability and then this chaos, it's so fascinating, because in 1905 there was a revolution in Russia, but yet in the telling of the Mennonite Commonwealth, that is just didn't happen, right? There's none of this instability that is taking place in the countryside. It's not incorporated into this dominant narrative. But we have Brent, how did, go on, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's just fine. I was going to say, just the nature of the literary narratives, right? Make it challenging. So when you do see authors trying to do it all, you get the Rudy Wiebe Blue Mountains of China, which is one of my favorite books that returns to this story, but it is work to do it, because it's not simple, right? The history is so complex that to trying to do it at all justice ends up being nearly unreadable.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So for our final question, some people are interested in maybe having a list of novels that have to do with the Russländer migration. You might not want to tell this to us tonight, but maybe would you supply us with a list that we could post later? Or if you wanted to list them off right now, that's also fine, in addition to the books that you talked about.
So in addition to the books that I talked about, I'm going to zip back here for a moment. I think as I was sharing my screen, it may have just sort of disappeared all at once. But these are a list of texts. I've just sort of picked ones that I thought people might have heard of for the most part. A couple of them are a little more unique here, but there's literally dozens. There's no shortage. The question is what it is that you're looking for. There's these memoirs, there's diaries, and then there is these fictional retellings. So I'm more than happy to provide a reading list of these texts and some others for readers. And I'd love for people to go check it out. There really is a remarkable tradition of interesting work that I wasn't able to do full justice to here tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for that fascinating talk. And everyone is going to go out and get their Russländer literature and start reading in preparation for 2023. And also check out the Tour Imagination site for tour information, and check out the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada website, which has listings of events that are taking place locally across Canada for 2023. And please consider joining us on March 15th, when we will continue this story with Packing for Canada, and we will take the archivist view of this migration. So thanks again, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us. It was a really great evening.
Thank you so much, Aileen. Thank you everybody for sticking around to talk about Mennonite literature. That's made my night. I appreciate the chance to chat with you.